What if the unthinkable happened, and the axis of resistance suddenly collapsed? If the smoke cleared over Tehran, and the stars and stripes flew over the Milad Tower, would the world finally find peace? Or would it simply be the preamble to a much larger, more terrifying global confrontation? For decades, the geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East has been anchored by the fierce rivalry between Washington and Tehran, a Cold War that has frequently threatened to turn white-hot. But in the realm of grand strategy, no vacuum remains empty for long. To understand the future of global conflict, we must ask the two most dangerous questions in modern diplomacy. If Iran falls, who is next on the American radar? And if Iran chooses to fight to the absolute bitter end, what is the true price of an American victory, not just in dollars, but in the very blood and bone of a superpower? To set the stage, we must acknowledge that Iran is not a mere rogue state in the traditional sense. It is a 1,000-year-old civilization with a geography that acts as a natural fortress. Nestled between the Zagros Mountains and the Persian Gulf, it sits atop the world's most vital energy artery, the Strait of Hormuz. For the United States, Iran represents the final piece of a puzzle that began with the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. It is the indispensable enemy. If we explore the first hypothetical, a total Iranian surrender or a sudden shift into the American orbit, we see a seismic shift in the global balance of power. Critics and historians often argue that American foreign policy requires a pivotal antagonist to justify its expansive security architecture. With Iran neutralized, the focus would inevitably and rapidly shift toward the remaining giants that challenge Western hegemony. The most immediate answer to who is next lies in the vacuum left behind. If Iran were to capitulate, the immediate domino effect would hit the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula. Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen would find themselves orphaned, losing their primary financier and ideological North Star. The United States would then likely turn its full, undivided attention to the great power competition, and without the Iranian distraction, the Pentagon's pivot to Asia would accelerate from a slow turn into a full-scale sprint. The primary target would be the containment of China, specifically within the first island chain. However, in the immediate vicinity of the Middle East, the focus would likely shift to the Caucasus and Central Asia, regions where Russian and Chinese interests overlap. A pro-American Iran would provide the U.S. with a direct land corridor to the Caspian Sea, effectively encircling the Russian Federation's southern flank and cutting off China's Belt and Road southern routes. But surrender is a political fantasy. The reality of the Persian psyche suggests a much grimmer path. This brings us to the second, more harrowing possibility: a war to the death. If the United States decided that regime change in Tehran was the only path forward, it would embark on the most difficult military campaign since World War II. Unlike the desert plains of Iraq, Iran is a nightmare of vertical geography. The Zagros Mountains are a natural defense system that makes a ground invasion a logistical suicide mission. To win, the United States would have to achieve total air superiority, but even that is not a guarantee of success. In this scenario, we must analyze the first major category of loss: the agony of the long war. In military circles, there is a saying, "The enemy gets a vote." If the U.S. initiates a strike, Iran's strategy will not be to win a conventional battle. They know they cannot match the F-35 or the carrier strike groups in a fair fight. Instead, they would employ mosaic warfare. This is a decentralized, asymmetrical approach where every valley, every basement, and every speedboat becomes a cell of resistance. The loss for the United States here is measured in time. An invasion of Iran would not be a 6-week sprint like the initial phase of the 2003 Iraq War. Analysts estimate that to truly occupy and win against a mobilized Iranian population of 85 million, the U.S. would need to commit upwards of 1 million troops. For context, that is nearly the entire active-duty strength of the U.S. armed forces. A prolonged conflict in the Iranian heartland would bleed the American treasury and morale in ways that make the 20-year war in Afghanistan look like a minor skirmish. In the first year alone, the U.S. would face a generational drain of its elite special forces and urban combat units. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, has spent 40 years preparing for this exact moment, building missile cities deep underground that are immune to conventional bunker busters. This means the U.S. would be forced into a tunnel-by-tunnel clearing operation. The psychological toll on American society would be immense. For the first time in decades, the American public would see casualty rates reminiscent of the Vietnam War. This isn't just about the soldiers on the front lines. It's about the erosion of the superpower image. Every day the war drags on. The perception of American invincibility fades, emboldening rivals in Eastern Europe and the South China Sea to take advantage of the distraction. Furthermore, the long war loss extends to the global economy. As soon as the first Tomahawk missile crosses the Iranian border, the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's petroleum passes, would become a graveyard of tankers. Iran doesn't need to win a naval battle to win this phase. They only need to sink a few large vessels in the narrowest channels to spike global oil prices to $200 or $300 a barrel. This would trigger a global depression, hitting the American consumer at the gas pump and the grocery store, creating internal political instability within the United States, just as it tries to fund a multi-trillion-dollar war. The cost of victory, therefore, starts with the total destabilization of the global financial system. Building upon the grim reality of a prolonged land campaign, we must now turn our gaze toward the blue waters of the Persian Gulf and the cold mathematics of the Pentagon's budget. If the United States decides to commit to a total victory over Iran, the most immediate and visible blow to its prestige would likely occur at sea. This brings us to the second major category of loss: the vulnerability of the supercarrier and the surface fleet. For a century, the U.S. Navy has been the undisputed master of the oceans, using its carrier strike groups as floating pieces of American sovereignty. However, the geography of the Persian Gulf is a geographic trap for these massive vessels. The Strait of Hormuz is, at its narrowest point, only about 21 miles wide. For a massive Ford-class or Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, this is like trying to maneuver a skyscraper through a crowded alleyway while snipers watch from the rooftops. Iran has spent decades developing a denial-of-access strategy specifically designed to counter American naval superiority. They do not need a matching fleet of destroyers. They only need thousands of fast attack boats, sea mines, and shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles. In a swarm scenario, the IRGC Navy could launch hundreds of small, explosive-laden speedboats simultaneously. While the Aegis combat system on American destroyers is the most advanced in the world, it faces a saturation problem. If 500 targets approach at once, the system's ability to track and intercept every single threat is pushed to its absolute breaking point. The loss of even a single American aircraft carrier would be a psychological and strategic catastrophe unmatched in modern history. Beyond the tragic loss of up to 5,000 sailors, the sinking of a carrier would signal the end of the era of the carrier and fundamentally alter how global powers view American military reach. Furthermore, Iran possesses the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. Missiles like the Fateh 110 and the Khalij Fars are specifically designed to hit moving targets at sea. If the U.S. Navy is forced to operate from outside the Persian Gulf to remain safe, its aircraft will require significantly more aerial refueling, slowing the pace of operations and increasing the wear and tear on an already strained fleet of tankers and support aircraft. This leads us directly into the third major category of loss: the astronomical financial cost of war. Modern warfare is an exercise in burning capital at an unprecedented rate. In the opening weeks of a conflict with Iran, the United States would likely expend thousands of precision-guided munitions. A single Tomahawk cruise missile costs roughly $2 million. A single interceptor missile used by a destroyer to knock down an incoming Iranian drone can cost up to $4 million. When you multiply these costs across a theater that spans the entire Middle East, the daily burn rate of the war could easily exceed several billion dollars. Estimates from various defense think tanks suggest that a full-scale invasion and subsequent stabilization of Iran could cost the United States anywhere from $3 trillion to $5 trillion over a decade. To put that in perspective, that is nearly 20% of the current U.S. national debt. Unlike the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which were funded largely through deficit spending during periods of relatively low inflation, a war with Iran would occur in a much more fragile global economic climate. The U.S. would be forced to choose between massive tax hikes, which would be politically suicidal, or printing more money, which would trigger hyperinflation and devalue the dollar on the global stage. Furthermore, we must account for the opportunity cost. Every $1 trillion spent on a war in the Iranian plateau is $1 trillion not spent on domestic infrastructure, the development of artificial intelligence, or the hardening of cyber defenses. While the U.S. is bogged down in the mountains of Iran, its primary global rivals, China and Russia, would be free to expand their influence without spending a single cent on combat. They would watch as the American military-industrial complex exhausts its stockpiles of smart weapons, knowing that it takes years, not months, to replenish sophisticated missile inventories. The financial loss also extends to the oil shock. As mentioned previously, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz would send energy markets into a frenzy. For the United States, which is now a net exporter of oil, the pain wouldn't just be at the pump. It would be the total disruption of the global supply chain. Most of the world's manufacturing in East Asia relies on Persian Gulf oil. If Chinese or Japanese factories shut down because they can't get fuel, the just-in-time delivery systems for electronics, car parts, and medical supplies in the United States would collapse. The economic damage to the American homeland would be felt in every household, potentially leading to civil unrest and a total breakdown of political consensus regarding the war's necessity. In summary, the price of victory in Iran is not just a military calculation. It is a fundamental threat to the American way of life. The U.S. might possess the raw power to win on the battlefield through sheer attrition and superior technology, but the financial and naval losses incurred would leave the superpower a shadow of its former self. It would be a Pyrrhic victory, a win so costly that it is functionally equivalent to a defeat. As we look toward the next phase of this analysis, we must ask, even if the U.S. can afford the money and the ships, can it afford the wildfire of a regional contagion that would surely follow? As the gears of a full-scale American military campaign against Iran begin to grind, the conflict would refuse to stay within the borders of the Iranian plateau. This brings us to the fourth and perhaps most unpredictable category of loss: the regional contagion. In modern geopolitics, Iran is not just a country. It is the heart of a resistance axis that spans from the Mediterranean Sea to the Hindu Kush. Unlike the relatively isolated regime of Saddam Hussein in 2003, Tehran has spent 40 years weaving itself into the fabric of its neighbors. The moment American boots hit Iranian soil, or the first bunker busters strike the Fordow enrichment facility, 1,000 sleeper cells and proxy armies would likely ignite across the Middle East. This is the horizontal escalation strategy. The U.S. would not just be fighting the Iranian regular army, it would find itself in a simultaneous 360-degree conflict. In Iraq, tens of thousands of heavily armed militia members would likely turn their weapons on the remaining U.S. bases in the region, turning green zones into kill zones overnight. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, possessing an arsenal of over 150,000 rockets and precision missiles, would be forced into a use it or lose it scenario, potentially launching a barrage that could overwhelm any missile defense system in the Levant. This loss is the loss of regional stability for a generation. The United States would be forced to divert massive amounts of resources just to protect its allies and its own diplomatic outposts in places like Jordan, Kuwait, and the UAE. Every American embassy in the Muslim world would become a potential target, requiring a global surge in security spending and a retreat from public diplomacy. The war on terror would be reignited on a scale tenfold what was seen in the 2000s, as the chaos provides fertile ground for radicalization. The U.S. would essentially be trapped in a regional firestorm that prevents it from addressing any other global crisis. The clash of philosophies. David versus Goliath in the 21st century. To understand if the U.S. can truly win, we must perform a direct comparison of the two nations' military doctrines. This is not just a comparison of tanks and planes, but of fundamental beliefs in how war is won. Feature: United States military doctrine, Iranian military doctrine. Primary goal: rapid decisive operations, RDO, strategic attrition and deterrence technology. High-end stealth, AI and satellite links, mass-produced drones, mines, and tunnels, command centralized but flexible top-down, highly decentralized mosaic cells, victory condition, destruction of enemy's ability to fight, survival and making the cost of war unbearable. The United States relies on technological overmatch, and the philosophy is to see first, shoot first, and destroy the enemy's brain, its command and control centers, within the first 72 hours. The U.S. Air Force and Navy are designed for a sprint, a high-intensity, high-speed kinetic event. If the war is short, the U.S. wins decisively. Iran, however, practices strategic patience. Their doctrine assumes that the U.S. will always have better technology. Therefore, Iran's philosophy is built on the power of the weak, and they focus on asymmetric tools, hundreds of cheap Shahed drones to exhaust expensive Patriot missiles, or suicide speedboats to threaten billion-dollar destroyers. Iran's victory doesn't require sinking the entire U.S. Navy. It only requires making the American public ask, "Why are we still there?" every time a flag-draped coffin returns home. This comparison reveals a dangerous mismatch. The U.S. is a Goliath designed to fight other Goliaths in open fields or empty skies. Iran is a David that has spent 40 years turning its entire geography into a slingshot. When the U.S. tries to apply its high-tech doctrine to Iran's mountainous, decentralized defense, the efficiency of American weaponry begins to drop. A $20 million Reaper drone can be brought down by a $50,000 modified surface-to-air missile. In a war of attrition, the side that spends less to destroy more usually wins. Can the U.S. win? Militarily, yes. The United States has the kinetic power to level every Iranian factory, sink every Iranian ship, and decapitate the political leadership. But in the 21st century, winning a war is not the same as ending a war. The US could win the battle for Tehran only to find itself in a permanent state of counterinsurgency across a landmass 4 times the size of Iraq, against a population that is far more nationalistic and unified. The comparison shows that while the US has the hammer, Iran has turned itself into liquid, and you cannot break liquid with a hammer. While the previous sections painted a picture of a quagmire, we must pivot to the opposite perspective to maintain a balanced, objective analysis. A common mistake in wargaming is mirror imaging, assuming the enemy is 10 feet tall and the superpower is incompetent. To be analytically honest, we must look at the scenario where the United States executes a lightning campaign that defies the skeptics. How could the US actually win without the catastrophic losses predicted? The first pillar of an American success would be cyberkinetic paralysis. Before a single physical bomb is dropped, the US Cyber Command would likely launch a Stuxnet on steroids offensive. If the US can successfully disable Iran's power grid, water systems, and internal military communications through the digital domain, the mosaic defense begins to crumble. A decentralized command structure is only effective if the cells know when to strike. Without a functioning nervous system, the Iranian body becomes a collection of isolated limbs. The second pillar is total air dominance. The U.S. Air Force operates on a level of stealth technology, the F-22, F-35, and B-21 Raider, that Iran's current air defense systems, such as the Bavar 373, or even the Russian-made S-300, have never truly faced in a high-intensity conflict. If the U.S. can eliminate Iran's eyes, its long-range radar, within the first 6 hours, the Iranian missile batteries become blind. In this scenario, the U.S. doesn't invade with 1 million troops. It uses standoff warfare, destroying Iran's military infrastructure from 1,000 miles away until the cost of maintaining the regime becomes higher than the cost of a coup from within. The domino effect. If not Iran, then who? Now let's revisit the original question. If Iran were to surrender or be neutralized, where does the American gaze shift? Geopolitics abhor a vacuum, and the removal of the Middle Eastern distraction would trigger a massive realignment of U.S. global strategy. 1. The final pivot to the Indo-Pacific. With the Iranian threat solved, the United States would no longer need to station 2 or 3 aircraft carrier strike groups in the Fifth Fleet, Middle East. These assets would immediately move to the Seventh Fleet in the Pacific. The primary target would be China. Specifically, the U.S. would focus on hardening the first island chain, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Japan. The goal would be a total maritime blockade capability to prevent Chinese expansion into the Philippine Sea. 2. The siege of the Northern Front. A pro-American or neutralized Iran would be the ultimate nightmare for Russia. Currently, Iran serves as a vital corridor for Russia to bypass Western sanctions, the North-South transport corridor. If that corridor flips to Western control, Russia's soft underbelly in the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan would become the next major theater of American diplomatic and covert influence. The U.S. would likely seek to station monitoring bases on the Caspian Sea, directly threatening Russia's energy dominance and its influence in Central Asia. 3. The redefinition of the rogue state. With Iran out of the picture, the rogue state label would likely be intensified against North Korea. Without the distraction of the Middle East, Washington could focus its full diplomatic and maximum pressure toolkit on Pyongyang. The US would have the bandwidth to build a much more robust Asian NATO, pressuring North Korea into a corner where its only options are total isolation or a high-risk military provocation. In this success scenario, the US doesn't just win a war, it wins a global restructuring. By removing the most significant regional challenger in the Middle East, the US effectively short-circuits the Eurasian alliance between Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing. However, this success relies on a perfect military execution, a feat rarely achieved in the history of human conflict. As we move into the final stages of our story, we must look at the most dangerous variable of all, the risk of a nuclear breakout during the final moments of a regime's life. As we reach the penultimate chapter of this hypothetical clash, we must confront the most terrifying variable in the entire equation: the Samson option. In the history of warfare, a cornered regime rarely accepts its demise quietly. If the United States successfully pushes the Iranian military to the brink of collapse, the world faces a nuclear breakout scenario. For years, the international community has debated Iran's breakout time, the window required to enrich enough uranium for a weapon. In the heat of an existential war, that window becomes the most critical clock in human history. If Tehran perceives that the end is near, the incentive to go nuclear becomes an act of ultimate survival. This is where the American strategy faces its greatest risk. If the U.S. intelligence fails to locate a hidden, deeply buried enrichment site, or if a dirty bomb is deployed as a last resort deterrent, the conventional war instantly transforms into a global nuclear crisis. The mere threat of such a weapon would paralyze global shipping and cause a mass exodus from major cities across the Middle East and Southern Europe. This is the end of certainty, the moment when the rules of engagement are shredded and the world enters a dark age of unpredictability. Beyond the nuclear threat, a victory over Iran would fundamentally break the current global order. For 80 years, the United States has maintained a system of alliances based on the protection of the commons. However, if the U.S. has to burn its economy and its naval prestige to conquer Iran, the global South may finally turn its back on Washington. Nations in South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, seeing the devastation of a 6,000-year-old civilization, might view the U.S. not as a global policeman, but as a global destabilizer. This leads to the fifth major category of loss: the loss of moral and diplomatic hegemony. While the U.S. might stand over the ruins of Tehran as a winner, it would likely find itself diplomatically isolated. The BRICS plus nations would likely accelerate the creation of a parallel financial system, completely bypassed by the US dollar. The victory in Iran would ironically be the catalyst that ends the American century. In this scenario, the US wins the battle but loses the world. The geopolitical map would be redrawn into two rigid blocks: a fortress west and a Eurasian shield. The gray zones of diplomacy would vanish, replaced by a permanent state of high-alert military readiness. This isn't just a loss of money or lives. It's the loss of the peace dividend that the world has enjoyed since the end of the Cold War. The resources that should be used to fight climate change, pandemics, or poverty would instead be funneled into a never-ending arms race to garrison the Iranian plateau and defend against the inevitable insurgency. Furthermore, we must consider the internal loss within the United States. A war of this magnitude, likely requiring a return to some form of military draft or extreme national mobilization, would tear at the fabric of American society. The political polarization currently seen in Washington would be amplified 1,000 times. The home front would become a second battlefield of information warfare, protests, and civil disobedience. The cost of war is often measured in foreign fields, but the deepest scars are always left at home. As the fires of the Middle East begin to settle into a smoldering, resentful peace, the United States would realize that it has inherited a graveyard of empires far larger and more complex than Afghanistan. The victory is a heavy crown, one that may eventually crush the head that wears it. In the final analysis of this hypothetical clash between the world's lone superpower and the fortress of the Middle East, we arrive at a sobering conclusion. Whether the United States achieves a tactical win through sheer technological might, or Iran manages to drag Washington into a decade-long war of attrition, the world that emerges on the other side will be unrecognizable. The Iranian problem is not a simple knot that can be cut with a sword. It is a complex web of history, geography, and ideology that, if severed, risks collapsing the entire global structure. To summarize the journey of this conflict, we must look at the total loss ledger for the United States. While the U.S. military is undeniably the most powerful force in human history, its victory over Iran would likely be a hollow victory. The losses would be measured in three distinct dimensions. 1. The strategic loss. By committing its vast resources to the Iranian plateau, the U.S. inadvertently gifts the 21st century to its great power rivals. While American carrier groups are dodging swarms of drones in the Persian Gulf, the influence of Beijing and Moscow would expand unchecked in Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. The pivot to Asia would remain a dream, delayed by another 30 years of Middle Eastern insurgency. 2. The economic loss. The cost of the war, estimated between $3 trillion and $5 trillion, combined with the inevitable global energy crisis, would likely end the era of the US dollar as the world's undisputed reserve currency. The oil shock of a closed Strait of Hormuz would trigger a global depression that could last a decade, hurting the American middle class more than any foreign enemy ever could. 3. The human and moral loss. Beyond the tragic casualties of thousands of sailors and soldiers, the United States would lose its soft power. A war of choice against a major regional power would be seen by much of the world as an act of overreach, leading to a diplomatic isolation that would make the post-Iraq War era look like a period of harmony. However, we must also consider the scenario of surrender. If Iran were to miraculously transition into a pro-Western partner without a shot being fired, the geopolitical map would tilt instantly. The U.S. would gain a land bridge to Central Asia, encircling Russia's southern flank and cutting off China's overland trade routes. But as history has shown in both Iraq and Afghanistan, regime change is rarely the end of the story. It is often just the beginning of a much more chaotic chapter. Ultimately, the question of whether the U.S. can win against Iran is the wrong question. The real question is, can the global system survive an American victory? The sheer scale of the Iranian geography, the sophistication of its asymmetric mosaic defense, and its influence over the axis of resistance make it a unique opponent. In this war, there are no winners in the traditional sense, only survivors in a much poorer, much more dangerous world. The story of a U.S.-Iran war is a cautionary tale of the limits of power. It serves as a reminder that in the modern age, the cost of victory can sometimes be so high that the only rational move on the chessboard is to ensure the game never starts. The shadow of the Sphinx remains, and for now, the world watches the Persian Gulf with bated breath, hoping that diplomacy can achieve what Tomahawk missiles and mosaic warfare never could, a lasting, stable peace. Final summary of the conflict. The next target. If Iran falls, the U.S. likely pivots immediately to the containment of China and the encirclement of Russia's southern border. The price of war. A Pyrrhic victory involving the potential loss of a supercarrier, a $5 trillion debt, and a global energy depression. The outcome: a military win for the U.S. is possible, but it results in a permanent insurgency and the end of American diplomatic hegemony. Therefore, if a U.S.-Iran war occurs, both sides, and indeed the entire world, will suffer consequences that could last for generations. The geography of Iran is a fortress that technology cannot easily conquer, and the spirit of its defense is a fire that billions of dollars cannot easily extinguish. In your opinion, based on the current global landscape, is a direct conflict between these two powers inevitable, or will the fear of the cost continue to prevent the first shot from being fired?